6 days before the collapse, a salvage drone pulled a data core out of the ice on Kessa Ring Station, and nobody thought to ask why its last transmission was a single word, repeated 41 times, in a language nobody on the crew could read. The translators flagged it as corrupted. The captain filed it under low priority. I filed it under I'll get to it later, which is a mistake I still think about more than I'd like to admit. My name is Mara Osei. I was the only human on a 9-person joint salvage crew working the outer hull of an abandoned Voss colony ring, and for 4 months my job had been simple. Keep the cutting torches running. Keep the pressure seals honest. Try not to give anyone a reason to send me home early. The Voss didn't dislike me. That would have required more attention than they gave me most days. They were a segmented, 4-armed people, patient and precise in a way that made human motion look sloppy by comparison, and they organized nearly everything they did around one law, the withdrawal mandate. Every Voss field worker wore a biometric collar that tracked exertion, injury, and fatigue against a fixed threshold. Cross the threshold, and the collar locked your suit's mobility systems and sounded a recall tone that every crew member within 2 kilometers was legally required to answer.
No exceptions. No appeals.
It had been law for 11 generations, since a mining collapse on their homeworld killed 300 workers who had kept digging past the point their bodies could safely carry them. I didn't wear a collar. Earthfleet didn't issue them, and the Voss crew found that fact more unsettling than almost anything else about me. You have no limit, Threll said to me once, in the tone someone might use to describe a design flaw. Threll commanded our extraction team. Broad through the shoulder plates, quiet in the particular way that came from calculation rather than shyness, the kind of quiet you learn to read like weather. How do you know when to stop? I don't, I told her. I know when to keep going. That's different. She didn't like that answer. I could tell because she didn't respond to it at all, just logged something into her wrist unit and moved on to the next section of hull. Voss silence was its own language, and after 4 months I still hadn't learned to read all of its dialects. Kessa Ring had been dead for 300 years by the time our salvage contract brought us to it, a colony habitat built in the shape of a slow, wide circle around a central docking spine, the kind of design a dozen species had favored once, before artificial gravity made the shape unnecessary. Whole sections of it had been stripped bare by scavengers over the centuries, cables pulled from the walls, anything valuable long since sold off through channels nobody bothered tracing anymore. What was left was mostly structure. Bones, Threll called it once, and the word stuck with me, because that's exactly what it felt like to walk through, some mornings. Working inside the bones of something that used to hold people, back when holding people had been its whole reason for existing. Most mornings on that crew looked the same. We suited up before the ring's internal cycle called it dawn, though dawn meant nothing on a station 300 years dead, powered now only by the salvage rig's portable generators. Ondu, the youngest of us, barely out of his second molt, always ran his equipment checks twice, muttering the sequence under his breath like a nervous habit he hadn't outgrown yet. Threll ran hers once, in silence, and never seemed to need the second pass. The rest of the crew fell somewhere in between, and I fell nowhere they had a category for, because I checked my own gear the way I'd been trained by people who'd never met a Voss and never would, and every difference in method got noticed on a crew this small, whether anyone said so out loud or not. I liked the rhythm anyway. I liked being useful in a way nobody had to thank me for. What I wanted, and I want to be honest about this because it matters later, was simple. I wanted this extraction to go clean.
No incidents.
No red marks on my file. Because when my transfer review came up in 8 weeks, I wanted somebody on that panel to look at 4 months of quiet, competent work and decide a human could be trusted on a mixed crew without a leash. That was the whole plan. Be steady. Be useful. Don't give them a reason to doubt me. Ondu, for his part, had a running theory that I was secretly terrible at my job and simply hadn't been caught yet, and he liked to test it at the worst possible moments. That particular morning, 40 minutes before anything went wrong, he handed me a torch with the calibration deliberately set 2 points off true, just to see whether I'd notice before I struck an arc with it. I noticed. I handed it back without a word and picked up my own, already calibrated, and he made the low-clicking sound Voss make instead of laughing, which took me 2 months to learn wasn't a warning noise. One day, he said, you will not notice, and I will finally have proof. One day, I said, you'll run out of tricks, and I'll still be here. Even Threll's antennae had drifted, very slightly, toward what I'd come to recognize as amusement, though she'd have denied it under formal questioning. It was, looking back, the last easy morning any of us had for a long time, And I'm glad, in a strange way, that we spent part of it on something as small as a misset torch and a bad joke, because there wouldn't be room for many more of those before the day was finished with us. The station had other plans. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it. A groan through the deck plating, low and long, like a whale sounding somewhere far beneath us. Threll's antennae flattened, which I'd learned meant alert, not alarmed. She checked her wrist unit. Structural integrity, 91%. Fine. Within tolerance. Old bones settling, said Ondu, trying too hard to sound unbothered. He kept cutting. I kept cutting too, but I found myself listening differently after that. There's a thing that happens to you after enough years doing dangerous, boring work. You develop a second attention, running quietly under the first, that just watches for wrongness. It isn't a superpower. It's closer to the feeling of knowing your own house well enough to notice when a door that's usually open is closed. Something about that groan had been wrong in a way 91% didn't explain. I didn't say anything. I didn't have the standing to say anything. I was the newest member of the crew, the only one without a collar, the only one whose judgment nobody had any particular reason to trust yet. So I filed it exactly the way the captain had filed that single repeated word from the data core 6 days earlier. Low priority. I'll get to it later. I want you to remember that I made that choice, because it matters, later, that the same mistake almost happened twice. Once by a captain who didn't know me, and once by a version of me who should have known better. We found the first sealed door 2 hours into the cut. It shouldn't have been sealed. Every schematic we had showed that section of the ring depressurized during the initial evacuation, centuries ago, which meant every internal door on that deck should have been locked open, not locked shut. Threll ran a scan and went still in the particular way VOS go still when a number surprises them. Atmosphere, she said. Behind this door. Breathable atmosphere. That shouldn't have been possible. A ring station abandoned for 300 years doesn't hold breathable air behind a single door unless something, or someone, had been actively maintaining the seal. We didn't know yet that there were people alive on the other side of it. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard the story told since as if I somehow guessed. I didn't guess anything. I just knew that a locked door with good air behind it, on a dead station, was not a detail anyone should file under low priority twice in the same week. The manual release had corroded shut. Threll's team tried the standard sequence. Pressure equalization, mechanical assist, thermal loosening. All of it came back empty. The hinge mechanism had fused. Cutting it open risked venting whatever was behind it straight into vacuum if the seal on the far side wasn't as solid as the reading suggested. We report it, Threll said. Command decides. That was correct procedure. It was also going to take 6 hours minimum for a decision to come back down the chain, and something about that door was pulling at the same second attention that had noticed the groan in the deck 2 hours earlier. I asked her for 10 minutes. She looked at me for a long moment. VOS don't do quick decisions, even small ones. Then she gave me exactly that. 10 minutes. Not because she trusted my judgment yet. Because 10 minutes cost nothing, and she was, I'd come to learn, someone who preferred to let a mistake prove itself rather than argue about whether it was one. I worked the hinge by hand. Not with the cutter. With a manual jack, a lot of patience, and the specific, unglamorous strength you build from years of exactly this kind of work. My suit's monitor logged 3 separate strain warnings on my left shoulder in those 10 minutes. I didn't stop for any of them. I want to be honest about why. Not because I couldn't feel them, and not because I didn't believe them. I stopped listening to them because I'd made a calculation, the same way Threll made calculations, and mine came out different than a collar's would have. A dislocated shoulder was a cost I could carry. A door that stayed shut for 6 more hours, on a station with unexplained breathable air behind it, was a cost I couldn't take back. Minute 6 brought the first real resistance, a grinding shift in the mechanism that told me the corrosion ran deeper than the surface I could see, and I remember pausing there, Jack braced against my shoulder, and running the same calculation Threll would have run with her collar, except mine came from somewhere else entirely. Not a fixed threshold measured against my body's limits. A weighing of 2 unknowns against each other. What might be lost if I stopped now, against what might be lost if I kept going and made things worse. There was no clean answer. There rarely is. In the moment you actually have to choose one. Minute 7, the strain warning on my shoulder upgraded from advisory to active, a small amber light at the edge of my visor that I'd learned, over 4 months, to treat as information rather than instruction. Minute 8, Ondu asked, for the second time, whether I wanted him to take over the jack, and for the second time I told him no, not because his help wouldn't have mattered, but because switching hands on a mechanism this close to giving would cost us more time than it saved, and time, right then, was the only resource neither of us could afford to spend carelessly. The hinge gave on minute 9. The door swung inward into a corridor that hadn't seen fresh air exchange in 3 centuries, and it was, against every reasonable expectation, occupied. Emergency lighting, dim and amber. Hand-built atmosphere scrubbers, decades old, patched and re-patched with whatever materials 300 years of scavenging had turned up. And down that corridor, moving toward the new light with the careful, measured step of people who have learned not to trust sudden change, came 4 figures. Not Voss. Not human. A species none of us recognized, small and pale-eyed, dressed in clothing stitched from what looked like generations of salvaged fabric layered one patch over another. Ondu made a sound I'd never heard a Voss make before. Threll simply stared, antennae rigid, running calculations I couldn't follow. I stood in the doorway with a dislocated shoulder I hadn't reported yet, looking at 4 people who had apparently been surviving alone inside a dead station for longer than I'd been alive, and I understood, with a particular clarity that comes right before everything gets much harder, that this was not going to be the clean, quiet extraction I'd been hoping for. It was going to be the extraction that decided whether anyone on this crew would ever fully trust me. Their names, we learned over the following hour, were difficult for either Voss or human throats to pronounce cleanly, so with their permission the crew used shortened forms. Pell, the eldest, silver-eyed and slow-moving, clearly the one the other 3 deferred to without needing to be told. Sarel, quieter, watching everything with the careful attention of someone cataloguing threats out of long habit. Corin, who never stopped holding Pell's sleeve the entire time we spoke, as though letting go might undo something. And a child, young enough that I didn't ask her age, old enough that she'd clearly been born inside that sealed corridor and had never once breathed air that hadn't first passed through a hand-patched scrubber. They were Ithran. None of us had heard the name before. Threll ran it through every database our equipment carried and came back with nothing, which unsettled her more than anything since the groan in the deck plating that morning. Pell told the story slowly, through a translator that struggled with the accent of a language spoken by 4 people, for 300 years, with no outside contact to correct it. A transport carrying Ithran colonists had made an emergency stop at the ring station during the original evacuation, centuries ago. Something had gone wrong, a fault in the transport's drive, Pell wasn't certain what, and the ship had never left. The Ithran aboard had sealed themselves into the most stable section they could find, rationed what they had, and survived on scavenged systems and a discipline I couldn't begin to imagine, generation after generation, waiting for a rescue that never came, because as far as anyone in the wider galaxy knew, the ring station was empty and the transport had simply been lost with all hands. "We heard your cutters 2 days ago," Pell said. "We did not know if you were rescue, or scavengers come to strip the hull for parts. We sealed the inner door and waited to learn which." I thought about the data core the salvage drone had pulled from the ice 6 days earlier. The single word, repeated 41 times, that nobody had bothered to have translated properly. I asked Threll to pull it up again, right there in the corridor, and I asked the Ithran directly whether they recognized it. Pell went very still. "That is our word for listening," she said. "It was our transport's beacon. It has broadcast that word for 300 years, waiting for someone close enough, with a receiver good enough, to answer it. Nobody had ever been close enough until a salvage drone happened to skim past the wreck buried in the ice 6 days ago, and even then, someone had filed it under low priority rather than have it properly translated. I didn't say that part out loud. I didn't have to. I could see Threll doing the same math I was doing, and neither of us found much comfort in the answer. While we waited, Threll took a moment to explain, quietly, why Command's response was likely to take as long as it would. Voss decisions involving unregistered civilian contact required sign-off from a regional continuity liaison, a layer of bureaucracy built, like nearly everything else in Voss governance, around the same instinct that had produced the withdrawal mandate itself. Nothing moved quickly if moving quickly risked a mistake nobody could take back. I understood the impulse. I wasn't sure yet whether I agreed with it, watching 4 exhausted survivors wait on a decision that 4 minutes of decisive action might have already answered for them. Sarel spoke for the first time then, in a voice rougher than Pell's, like he used it less often. We stopped counting the years at some point. It became easier not to know exactly how long. Easier for her. He nodded toward the child, who had drifted close enough to study my glove hand as though she'd never seen fabric like it before. She has only ever known the corridor. I did not want her to know it as a number of years. I wanted her to know it as home. I crouched down to her level, slow enough not to startle her, and she reached out and touched 2 fingers to the seam on my glove, testing it the way you test ice before trusting your way to it. "What's your name?" I asked her. It took the translator a moment to catch her answer, quiet and careful. "Vesa." "Hello, Vesa. I'm Mara." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull her hand back either, and something about that felt, in the middle of everything else that morning had already become, like the first small thing that had gone entirely right. Pell showed us the corridor while we waited for Command's response, and it was, in its own way, more remarkable than anything Threll scans had picked up. 300 years of survival had built a kind of quiet architecture into every surface. Scrubber housings labelled not with words but with small carved marks, a different symbol for each generation that had repaired them, so that reading the housing top to bottom was, Pell explained, something like reading a family tree. A garden, tiny and fiercely tended, grown from a handful of seed stock that had somehow lasted 3 centuries in cold storage, producing something that wasn't quite food and wasn't quite decoration but seemed to matter to them as both. A wall near the sealed door covered in hand marks, layered generations deep, that Corin told us, when I asked, was simply how you said goodbye to a door you might never open again. Every Ithran who left through it, however briefly, pressed a palm to the wall first. "Do you press it when you come back too?" I asked. Corin considered the question as though nobody had ever asked her that exact thing before. "No," she said. "Coming back does not need marking. Only the leaving." Vesa, for her part, had lost interest in the conversation entirely and was instead attempting, with great seriousness, to determine whether my suit's exterior plating was a single piece or several, running one small finger along every seam she could reach until Sarel gently pulled her back, murmuring something in their own language that made her huff in the universal, cross-species manner of a child who has just been told no. It was such an ordinary sound, so completely unremarkable, that for a moment I forgot entirely that I was standing in a corridor 300 years removed from the last time anyone outside had heard a child complain about anything at all. Command's response came back 40 minutes later, and it was not what I expected. The ring station's atmosphere was failing faster than any of the models had predicted. The same groan I'd heard in the deck plating 2 hours earlier had, we now understood, been an early structural warning that 91% integrity had badly understated. Whatever had kept the ring stable for 3 centuries was coming apart on a timeline measured now in hours, not weeks. Command's order was simple and absolute. Full evacuation of all personnel, human, Voss, and the 4 newly discovered Ithran, within a 6-hour window.
No exceptions.
No delay for further study. 6 hours to move 4 fragile survivors and an entire salvage crew through a structure that was actively failing, across sections that hadn't seen structural inspection in 300 years. With no guarantee the corridors would still be intact by the time we reached them. Before she gave the order, Threll did something I hadn't seen her do before. She opened a second channel, separate from the crew line, and logged a formal notification to what she called the continuity board, the body responsible for reviewing every field commander's conduct against mandate doctrine after any emergency involving civilian recovery. It was, she explained tersely while the channel connected, standard procedure, required whenever a commander anticipated a scenario where crew members might approach or exceed threshold limits. The board didn't grant permissions in advance. It simply recorded intent, so that afterward, whatever happened, there would be a clean record of what the plan had been before the ring decided whether to cooperate with it. I asked her, once the channel closed, what happened to a commander whose crew crossed those limits anyway, in ways the plan hadn't accounted for. "Review," she said. "Formal review, if the crossing was severe enough. A commander who allows repeated threshold violations under her command, even in an emergency, can be relieved of extraction authority pending investigation. It has happened to commanders I trained under. It is not a small thing to be found responsible for a crew crossing a line the law exists specifically to prevent." I filed that away without saying much, because there wasn't anything useful to say to it yet, but I understood, standing in that corridor with a dying station groaning around us, that every decision I was about to make in the next 6 hours carried a cost for someone besides myself. If I pushed my own limits and it went badly, I risked my own safety and possibly my transfer review. If Threll's crew crossed theirs under her command, she risked something that had taken her a career to build. Threll turned to her crew and began issuing the extraction plan in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of emergency her whole career. I listened, and understood, and felt the same second attention that had noticed the groan in the deck now telling me something else entirely. A plan built for 4 healthy Voss adults, 1 relatively fit human, and a support team was not the same plan you needed for 4 Ithran survivors, one of them a child who had never in her life walked more than the length of a corridor she could see the ends of. Threll's plan was sound. It was also going to leave someone behind, because Voss extraction doctrine, like everything else in their culture, was built around a threshold, and the threshold assumed everyone moving through that dying station would be able to keep pace. I was the only person on that crew without a collar telling me where my own limit was. I had 6 hours to decide what that was actually worth. We split the crew into 2 teams. Threll took the lead group toward the primary evacuation corridor, the fastest route, the one the ring's remaining structural supports were most likely to hold. I asked to take the second group, Pell, Sarel, Korin, Vesa, and Ondu as backup, through the slower route, the one that ran past the failing hydroponics bay we'd been cutting through that morning, because it was the only path level enough for Vesa to walk on her own without being carried the whole way, and carrying her the whole way would cost us time we didn't have. Threll didn't like it. I watched her run the calculation, the same way she'd run every calculation since I'd met her, and I watched her arrive somewhere she clearly wasn't comfortable with. That route crosses under the section that groaned this morning, she said. I know. You would be moving the most fragile people we have under the least stable section of the ring. I know that too. She looked at me for a long moment. Then why? It wasn't really a question. It was the same question she'd asked me on my first week aboard, dressed differently. How do you know when to stop? I didn't have a clean answer for her then, and I still didn't have one that would translate cleanly into Voss reasoning now, so I gave her the only honest thing I had. Because the fast route means carrying a child who's never walked farther than she could see, at a pace that terrifies her, past strangers, through a station that's already killing itself. The slow route means she walks on her own legs, at a pace she can manage, next to people who aren't asking her to trust them with her whole body on the first day she's ever met them. That's worth the extra time to me. If the ceiling comes down, it comes down. I'd rather be wrong about the ceiling than wrong about her. Threll didn't answer that. She gave the order to split the teams and went to lead her own group toward the primary corridor, and I did not know, as she walked away, whether I'd just made the last decision anyone would ever let me make on that crew, or the first one that actually mattered. The hydroponics bay had changed since that morning. Whatever the groan 2 hours earlier had signaled, it had left the whole compartment listing very slightly off true, just enough that water still pooled in the drainage channels along one wall instead of running the way it was designed to. Vesa noticed it before any of the adults did. She stopped in the doorway and stared at the tilted floor with an expression I couldn't read through the translator, something between fascination and fear, and Sarel had to speak to her quietly in their own language before she'd take another step. She has never seen a room that wasn't level, Pell explained. Everything she has known was built to hold still. We moved slowly through the bay, past dead planting racks that had once grown food for a colony 300 years gone, Ondu walking point with his cutter ready in case the route ahead needed clearing, and me walking beside Vesa, matching her pace instead of asking her to match mine. Sarel went down 40 minutes in. Not from the structure. From exhaustion. 300 years of rationed calories and controlled activity had built the Ithran into people extraordinarily good at surviving on very little, and extraordinarily bad at sustained physical effort under stress. Sarel's legs simply stopped answering him about 2/3 of the way through the bay, and he went down hard against a support strut, breathing in the short, panicked way that told me his body had crossed some threshold his mind hadn't agreed to yet. Ondu's collar chimed a warning of its own, proximity to a medical emergency, standard Voss protocol, requiring him to log the incident and hold position until Threll's team could be redirected toward us before continuing. That protocol made sense in a stable structure. It made no sense at all in one that was actively coming apart above our heads, and I watched Ondu freeze in the particular way young Voss froze when the law and the moment stopped agreeing with each other. I didn't have a collar telling me to wait. I had a man on the deck plating in front of me, and a child 6 meters away watching him with an expression I recognized from my own childhood, from the one time I'd seen my father go down in front of me and hadn't known yet that he would be fine. I got to Sarel, check his breathing, check the dilation of eyes that weren't built quite like human eyes but responded to the same basic signs of shock, and found his pulse, thin and rapid under skin gone cold at the wrists, the kind of reading that on a human patient would have meant we were already losing him. Pell knelt on his other side, one hand pressed flat against his chest, murmuring something low and steady in Ithran that the translator didn't attempt to render, and I understood, without needing the words, that it was the sound of someone trying to keep a person tethered to consciousness through voice alone, a technique 300 years of isolated survival had apparently perfected out of necessity, when no medical equipment existed to do the job instead. I made the calculation that would end up mattering more than anything else I did that day. I didn't wait for Threll's team. I didn't log an incident and hold position. I stabilized him myself, with a field kit built for human physiology and Voss physiology and nothing else, adapting it on instinct for a species I'd known for less than 2 hours, and I kept us moving 12 minutes later, Sarel on his feet again, slower, leaning on me, but moving. Ondu watched the whole thing without saying a word. When I finally looked at him, his antennae had done something I hadn't seen them do before. Not the flat alert posture, not the rigid stillness of calculation. Something closer to what I'd have called, on a human face, uncertainty. "You didn't wait for the collar's answer," he said. "There wasn't time to wait for it. You could have logged it and continued. That is permitted." I know. I didn't need permission to keep him breathing. I needed 12 minutes, and I had them. He didn't respond to that either. But he didn't freeze again for the rest of the walk, and somewhere in that silence I understood that whatever I'd just done had moved something in him that 4 months of quiet, careful, rule-following work had never managed to move before. We reached the rendezvous point 11 minutes behind Threll's team, and 11 minutes ahead of the deadline command had given us, which felt, for about 90 seconds, like the closest thing to victory I'd had since the whole day started. Threll's group was already there, already running pre-transport checks, already looking like a crew that had executed a clean extraction exactly the way Voss doctrine intended it to go. My group arrived slower, dirtier, one Ithran leaning on my shoulder and a child who hadn't stopped watching me with wide, careful eyes since I'd stabilized her father, and for a moment the contrast between the two teams was stark enough that I felt it like a physical thing. The fast, correct, disciplined evacuation, and the slow, human, adapted on-the-fly one, arriving late and improvised and somehow, impossibly, also successful. Threll looked at Sarel, upright and breathing normally, and at the readout from my field kit that I handed her without being asked, and at Vesa, who had walked the entire route on her own legs and was now standing close enough to Ondu that he'd apparently, at some point in the last stretch, become the person she trusted most on the crew that wasn't me. "You made the correct call," Threll said. It cost her something to say it. I could hear that it cost her something. Pell crouched beside Sarel and pressed her forehead briefly against his, a gesture the translator didn't attempt to explain and I didn't ask about, and Corin finally let go of the fabric she'd been holding since the door first opened, as though some part of her had only now decided it was safe to. Vesa found me a moment later, tugging at my sleeve until I crouched down to her level again. She held up both hands, fingers spread, and then folded one down, counting something out for me with the careful precision of a child showing off a skill she'd only recently mastered. "4," she said, through the translator, then pointed at herself, at Sarel, at Pell, at Corin. "4 of us. And you." She held up a 5th finger, considering it. "5, now. You are the 5 now too." I didn't have a good answer for that. I've thought about it many times since, and I still don't. I told her that sounded about right, and she seemed satisfied with that, and went back to standing very close to Ondu, who had, without any of us quite noticing when it happened, become the second person on the crew she decided to trust completely. Threll was running final checks on the shuttle's boarding sequence when I caught her watching the two of them, Vesa and Ondu, with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not quite surprise. Closer to the look of someone recalculating a figure they'd assumed was fixed. "He has never been trusted that quickly by anyone," she said, not quite to me, not quite to herself. Not even by his own crew, when he first joined us. "Maybe it's easier for her," I said. "She's never had a reason to build the same defenses the rest of us have." Threll considered that longer than the comment probably deserved, the way she considered most things, and didn't answer before the shuttle's boarding chime sounded, calling us all forward, and for about 90 seconds, standing there watching 6 survivors of 3 separate species preparing to leave a dying station together, I let myself believe the hardest part of the day was over. We had 6 people who shouldn't have survived the last 300 years, all of them alive, all of them accounted for, and a transport shuttle inbound to pull us off the ring before whatever had been holding it together for 3 centuries finally let go. Then the deck beneath the rendezvous point dropped 4 centimeters, all at once, with a sound like the whole station exhaling, and every collar on every Voss crew member within range began screaming at the same time. The second collapse wasn't a groan. It was a decision the station made all at once, in the space of about 8 seconds, and it took the primary evacuation corridor down with it, the fast route, the correct route, the one Threll's team had used to reach the rendezvous point 20 minutes earlier. We were still standing there when it happened, which was the only reason any of us survived the initial drop. The shuttle bay beyond us held, barely, its structural supports groaning under a load they hadn't been built to carry for 300 years. But the corridor behind us sealed itself under 11 meters of collapsed decking in a matter of seconds, and the transport shuttle's automated systems, reading catastrophic structural failure across half the ring, made the only decision fleet safety protocol allowed it to make. It began an immediate emergency launch sequence, with a 2-minute window to board, no exceptions, timer already running. 2 minutes. 6 survivors who needed to move through the shuttle bay's airlock, one of them a child, one of them a man who could barely stand 90 seconds ago, and every Voss collar in the group screaming past its threshold from the shock of the drop. The sound of it, 5 separate lockout tones firing within the same half-second, led into something almost musical, if music could carry that much wrongness inside it. I'd never heard it before that moment. I hope, honestly, that I never hear it again. Around me, 5 Voss who had spent the entire day moving with the same fluid, practiced precision suddenly went rigid mid-stride, joints locking exactly where the mobility systems had caught them, arms half raised, one leg still lifted off the deck in Dessa's case, so that for one disorienting second the 5 of them looked less like people caught in an emergency and more like a display of statues. Frozen at the exact instant a bell had rung somewhere none of us could hear. Every collar locked at once. I understood, watching it happen, exactly what the withdrawal mandate meant when it was actually enforced rather than discussed. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a recommendation a disciplined worker could choose to override the way I'd been overriding my own thresholds all day. Voss mobility systems simply stopped answering commands past the threshold, a hard mechanical lockout built into 300 years of law, and every single member of Threll's crew, mid-stride toward the shuttle, found their suits refusing to move any further from the collapse zone. Threll fought it. I watched her fight it, watched her try 3 times to override a system with no override built into it, because the entire point of the mandate was that it couldn't be argued with by the person it was protecting. "Go," she said to me, through gritted words, still fighting a suit that wouldn't answer her. "Get them aboard. We are locked. We cannot cross." I had 90 seconds left on the timer, 6 survivors who needed to move, and a crew of Voss now physically unable to help me finish the job. I didn't have a threshold telling me to stop. I had 90 seconds, and I used every one of them. I carried Vesa first, because she was lightest, and because leaving her for last felt like a mistake I wouldn't survive making. She didn't fight me, didn't cry out, just wrapped both small hands into the front of my suit and pressed her face against my shoulder the whole way, and I remember thinking, absurdly, in the middle of everything else, that it was the first time all day she'd let herself look like exactly what she was, which was a child who had never once been asked to be this brave. I felt her counting again against my collarbone, the small folding motion of fingers she'd shown me minutes earlier, though I couldn't tell whether she was counting steps, or seconds, or something else entirely that only made sense to a person who had spent her whole life learning to measure time by whatever was in front of her. Then I went back for Sarel, half carrying him across a gangway shuddering under a live structural failure, his weight uneven against my shoulder in a way that told me his legs still weren't fully answering him, and he said something in Ithran, low and fast, that the translator rendered a half-second late as I did not think I would see open sky again, and now I am afraid of losing it. I didn't have an answer that would have meant anything at that speed, across that gangway, so I just kept moving, and hoped that was answer enough. Then Corin, who gripped the collar of my suit with both hands the entire crossing and didn't say a single word, and then Pell, who was the heaviest and the slowest and never once asked me to go easy on her, moving faster than my body had any real right to move. My own suit throwing warnings I stopped reading somewhere around the second trip, because reading them wasn't going to change what I needed to do next. 23 seconds left on the timer when I got the last of them aboard. I turned back toward the rendezvous point, toward Threll and Ondu and the rest of the crew standing locked in place by the law that had kept their people alive for 11 generations, and understood, with a clarity that didn't feel like a decision so much as a fact I'd already known, that the shuttle's 2-minute window did not care what I understood, and that I was not going to make it back across that gangway a 5th time before it closed. The doors sealed at the 18-second mark. I was on the wrong side of them. The shuttle launched on schedule, exactly as its safety protocol required, carrying 6 survivors to a rescue ship holding position at a safe distance. I found out later that Pell had to be physically restrained from trying to override the airlock controls to come back for me, and that Vesa hadn't said a single word for the first 20 minutes of the flight, watching the ring shrink behind the viewport like she was afraid it would disappear before someone explained to her why I wasn't on it too. On the ring itself, I had a crew of locked Voss crew members, a station actively finishing the process of falling apart, and roughly 4 minutes before the section we were standing in reached the same structural threshold the corridor behind us had already crossed. Threll's collar wouldn't move her. Mine had no collar to argue with, which meant I was, for the first time since I joined that crew, the only person on the ring physically capable of doing anything at all. There was a secondary airlock 200 meters down a service corridor, unrated for emergency evacuation but structurally intact according to the last scan before the collapse, connected to a maintenance shuttle small enough to hold 6 adults if nobody minded being uncomfortable. It wasn't a good plan. It was the only plan that existed. "You cannot carry all of us," Threll said. Her voice had lost the clipped precision I'd grown used to. It sounded, for the first time, like someone doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. "There are 5 of us. You have perhaps 3 trips before the section fails. Then I'd better be fast on the first 2. One of Threll's crew, a quiet worker named Isk who'd said maybe a dozen words to me across 4 months, caught my arm before I moved. "Locked collars still transmit," he said. "Fast, urgent, nothing like his usual careful pace. If our suits fail before you reach us, our positions stay live for a few seconds after. Look for the beacon light, not for us. In the dark, the light will find you faster than your eyes will find a person." It was, I realized later, the single most useful thing anyone said to me that whole day, and I never got the chance to thank him properly for it, because by the second trip the emergency lighting had failed along that stretch of corridor and I was moving entirely by the small green pulse of collar beacons against the dark, exactly the way he told me I would need to. I want to describe what the next 4 minutes felt like, and I find that I can't, not really, not in a way that would mean anything to someone who wasn't there. There is a version of exhaustion that stops being a feeling and becomes a kind of silence, where your body keeps answering requests without commentary, and I lived inside that silence for as long as it took to get Ondu and the youngest of Threll's crew to the maintenance shuttle, and then back for the next 2, the deck under my boots changing pitch in a way that told me the section's remaining structural life was measured now in seconds rather than minutes. I want to be honest about the part of the story people ask about most, later. I did not feel brave. I did not think about the withdrawal mandate, or what it meant that I didn't have one, or any of the larger questions this day was apparently going to force onto every Voss who heard about it. I thought about the 18 seconds the shuttle door had taken to seal, and the fact that I had 4 minutes now instead of 90 seconds, and that 4 minutes, used correctly, was enough. Before I went back for Threll, one of the younger Voss, a broad-shouldered engineer named Des who'd barely spoken to me across 4 months beyond routine equipment checks, grabbed my arm on the way past and pointed to his own locked wrist unit. "There is a manual release," he said, fast, his voice tight with something between hope and desperation. "Behind the housing. It requires 2 hands and a tool I do not have free. If you had 30 seconds to spare, you could force it, and I could walk myself the rest of the way, and you would not need to carry me at all." I didn't have 30 seconds to spare, and both of us knew it before he finished saying it. I told him so, as gently as 4 minutes and a failing structure allowed for gentleness, and something in his posture settled anyway, not resignation exactly, closer to the specific relief of a person who was offered the only thing he had to give, even knowing it wouldn't be needed, because the offering mattered on its own. I carried him the last stretch to the maintenance shuttle the same as the others, and he didn't ask again, and I've thought about that 30 seconds more than almost anything else from that day, because it was the moment I understood that the lockout wasn't just physical for the Voss. It cost them something to stand still and be saved by someone else's choice instead of their own legs, and every one of them bore that cost differently, and every one of them bore it anyway. I went back for Threll last, because command authority meant she'd insisted on it, in the flat, immovable tone of someone whose collar had made the argument for her before she'd even opened her mouth. By the time I reached her, the corridor behind us had already begun the low, structural groan I recognized now, the same one I'd heard that morning and filed under low priority, except this time there was no ambiguity left in it at all. "Leave the calculations for later," I told her, getting an arm under her locked suit's frame. "Right now, I just need you to let me carry you." Something in her posture changed. I didn't understand it in the moment. I understood it afterward, when I had time to think about what it must mean to a Voss commander, raised inside 11 generations of a law built entirely around the idea that no one should ever have to be carried past their own limit by someone who hadn't been asked to be carried anyway, by someone who had never once needed permission to decide that carrying her was worth it. We made the maintenance shuttle with 19 seconds to spare, by my suits count, though I stopped fully trusting my suits count somewhere around the second trip. The section behind us went dark and silent less than a minute after the airlock sealed, the whole length of it dropping away into whatever remained of the ring's failing structure, and for a long moment none of us said anything at all. 6 of us packed into a shuttle built for comfort and rated for none of what we'd just asked of it, listening to our own breathing in the sudden absence of anything else to listen to. Recovery took longer than the crisis had. My shoulder, the one I'd dislocated hours earlier freeing the Ithran-sealed door and never properly reported, turned out to have done considerably worse than dislocate somewhere in the last 4 minutes of carrying, and the medical bay on the rescue ship kept me under observation for 2 full days before anyone would let me have a real conversation with anyone. Ondu visited first, on the evening of the first day, and stood at the foot of the bed the way I'd noticed Voss did when they weren't sure whether they'd been invited. He didn't say much. He told me Vesa had asked 3 separate crew members whether I was going to be all right before anyone thought to just bring her to the medical bay and let her see for herself, and that when she finally did, she'd stood in the doorway for a long moment before crossing the room and placing her small hand flat against my good shoulder, checking, the way she'd checked the seam of my glove that first morning, that this too was real and not something that might come apart if she trusted it too. Quickly. Isk came the next morning, before Threll, still moving stiffly from whatever the collar lockout had cost his own joints during the wait. He didn't sit. He stood at a careful distance, the way I was learning some Voss did when they had something to say that mattered enough to make them nervous about saying it badly. "You found the beacons," he said. Not quite a question. "I found the beacons. You were right about the light finding me faster than my eyes would." He seemed to turn that over for a moment. "I have served 4 extraction commanders in 11 years. None of them ever asked me, in the field, whether I had a piece of knowledge worth sharing before a crisis. You did not ask either. You simply needed it, and I had it, and it did not occur to either of us to make that transaction more complicated than it needed to be." He paused. "I have been trying to decide, since yesterday, whether that says something about you, or about me, or about the 11 years before you arrived. I have not decided yet. I wanted you to know I was still deciding." I told him that seemed like a fair thing to still be deciding, and he made a small motion with 2 of his 4 hands that I hadn't learned yet, and left before I could ask him what it meant, which felt, somehow, exactly like the kind of thing Isk would do. Threll came to see me on the second day. She stood at the foot of the bed for a while without speaking, which I'd learned by then meant she was choosing her words rather than lacking them. "The mandate exists," she said finally, "because 11 generations ago, workers who trusted their own judgment over their body's limits killed 300 people who trusted them back. The law was built to remove that trust from the equation entirely, to make the decision for us, so that no one would ever again have to find out too late that their judgment had failed the people counting on it." "I know the history," I said. "You told me on my first week. I told it to you as a warning. I am not certain, now, that I told it to myself the same way." She moved to the single chair beside the bed and did not sit in it, resting one hand on its back instead, as though the conversation still required her to be standing for it. There was a version of that day I have carried since I was young enough to first wear a collar of my own. My mother was assigned to a survey team on our homeworld's southern ice shelf, 3 years before I was born. A junior surveyor on her team ignored 2 separate threshold warnings, convinced his own judgment was sound enough to override what his body was telling him. He was correct, as it happened. He survived. But the confidence it gave the rest of the team, the belief that judgment alone could be trusted over the collar's warning, cost 4 of them their lives 8 months later, in a collapse none of them saw coming until it was already past the point anyone's judgment could have saved them. My mother told me that story every year, on the day the mandate became law, so that I would never mistake one lucky outcome for a safe method. That's not a bad thing to be taught.
No.
It is not. She looked at me directly then, in the way Voss rarely did, most conversations conducted at an angle, out of some old cultural habit I'd never fully understood. But I have spent 11 years applying that lesson to every situation I have ever led a team through, and until yesterday it had never once failed me. I did not know what to do with a day where it did. I did not understand it, until yesterday, as anything but a law. A correct one. A necessary one. She paused. "I have spent this entire assignment believing you had no limit, because Earth had failed to build one into you. I told you that once, as if it were a flaw. I remember. I was wrong about the shape of it. You have a limit. I watched you reach it, carrying the last of my crew across a corridor that was actively failing beneath you. The difference is not that you lack one. The difference is that you decide, each time, whether the person beside you is worth crossing it for. My people built a law that makes that decision for us, because 11 generations ago, someone's version of that same choice went wrong in a way that cost 300 lives. I do not think the law was a mistake. She looked at me for a long moment. But I do not think it is the whole answer either. Not anymore. I didn't have anything wise to say to that. I was tired, and my shoulder hurt in a way that made most attempts at eloquence fall apart before they left my mouth, so I told her the only true thing I had. You broke it anyway, at the end. Your collar was still locked and you let me carry you, when every part of 11 generations of law would have told you to make me leave you behind and save the trip. Yes, she said. I did. She was quiet for a moment, turning something over that I could tell she hadn't fully settled even now, 2 days removed from the corridor. There is a version of that choice I have run through many times since, she said. Where I refuse. Where I tell you to save the final trip and leave me for the section to take, because that is what 11 generations of doctrine would call the correct sacrifice. One commander's life against the risk of losing you both to a collapse neither of us could have outrun carrying two. I have run that version, and in every version of it, I do not know if you would have listened to me. I wouldn't have. I know, she said, and there was something almost like relief in how quickly she said it. That is, I think, the part when I'm still deciding how to feel about. Why? She considered the question with the same weight she gave every question, turning it over before answering. Because I had watched you make that same choice 4 times already that day, for people who were not your crew, who were not even your species, who had no claim on you beyond the fact that they needed someone to choose them. I decided, in that corridor, that I was willing to be chosen too. That is not a decision the mandate makes for me. I do not think it is a decision any law should try to make for anyone. The Ithran were resettled within the month, given proper medical care, proper nutrition, and, at Pel's specific request, a modest apartment close enough to the shuttle bay that Vesa could watch ships coming and going whenever she wanted. Something she'd apparently decided was the single best thing about the wider galaxy she'd never expected to see. Sarel took up work in the same shuttle bay not long after, slow at first, then steadier, learning a trade 300 years late and treating every shift like a gift he hadn't expected to live long enough to receive. Corin, of all of them, adjusted fastest, though she still pressed her palm flat against the doorframe every time she left their apartment, an old habit from a wall 300 years gone that she told me once she wasn't ready to give up yet, and didn't see any particular reason why she should have to. Threll filed a formal review of the withdrawal mandate with Voss Command 3 weeks after the collapse. I read the report once, much later, after it had made its way through 11 layers of review and become, against every reasonable expectation for a document written by a field commander about a single incident, the beginning of an actual policy change. It didn't argue that the mandate was wrong. It argued something narrower and harder to dismiss. That a law built entirely to remove trust from the equation had, in practice, also removed the possibility of choosing to be trusted, and that on the day the ring failed, it had been the second thing, not the first, that saved 6 lives the law itself couldn't reach. The Continuity Board opened its review of Threll's conduct 4 days after the collapse, exactly as she told me it would. I wasn't present for it, but Ondu was, called as a witness alongside the rest of the crew, and he told me afterward that the hardest question Threll faced wasn't about the collapse itself, or the locked collars, or even the decision to let herself be carried across a failing gangway by someone outside her chain of command. It was simpler than that, and harder to answer cleanly. The board asked her whether, given the same 6 hours again, she would issue the same order to split the teams. She told them yes. She told them she would issue it faster, next time, and with less deliberation, because the deliberation had cost minutes she now understood she couldn't have afforded to lose twice. The board cleared her of misconduct within the week, citing the emergency provisions that already existed for exactly this kind of extreme circumstance, but Ondu said the vote hadn't been unanimous, and that the dissent, when it came, wasn't really about Threll at all. It was about me, and about what her decision to trust my judgment over a plan built entirely around thresholds meant for every commander who might someday face the same choice with a human on their crew, and no clean doctrine yet written to tell them what to do about it. That dissent is, as far as I know, still part of the official record. I've never gone looking for it. I don't think I need to read what someone I've never met thinks I represent, in order to know what actually happened in that corridor, and what it cost, and who was still standing at the end of it. Command didn't rewrite 11 generations of doctrine because of one incident. That's not how institutions work, and I'd have been suspicious of the story if it claimed otherwise. But they added a provision, narrow and specific, allowing collar overrides in confirmed multi-casualty emergencies, logged and reviewed after the fact rather than prevented beforehand. A small change, built entirely around the idea that sometimes the person standing next to the threshold is in a better position to judge it than the law was, 300 years ago, when it was written. Isk told me later that 2 other field commanders had already cited the incident in their own proposals for similar exceptions, in sectors neither Threll nor I had ever worked, which was the point in the whole process where I stopped thinking of it as one bad day on one dying station and started understanding it as something that had, in whatever small way, outlasted the day itself. I stayed on the crew. My transfer review came up 8 weeks later, same as scheduled, and I sat in front of a panel that had, by then, already read Threll's report, and nobody asked me a single question about incidents or red marks or whether a human could be trusted on a mixed crew without a leash. Ondu told me afterward that the question they'd actually debated, in the closed session before I was called in, was whether 4 months was long enough to justify what they were about to do, which was recommend me for permanent assignment rather than the standard rotational review every exchange worker got. 4 months turned out to be long enough. I don't think it was really about the 4 months. Ondu changed more than any of us in the weeks after, though it took me longer to notice it in him than in Threll, maybe because I'd spent less time expecting him to stay exactly the same. He stopped waiting for the collar's answer before making small calls in the field, the kind of judgment calls a junior crew member is technically allowed to make without escalation but rarely does, out of the particular caution young Voss carry until something teaches them they're allowed to trust themselves. He never told me directly that any of it traced back to the hydroponics bay, to a man on the deck plating and a child watching, but he did ask me once, months later, mid-shift, with no real preamble, whether I thought a person could learn to trust their own judgment the same way they'd trust a collar, given enough time and enough small moments where the judgment turned out to be right. I told him I thought that was probably the whole answer, if there was one. He didn't say much back, but he ran his equipment checks only once after that, in silence, the way Threll always had, and never seemed to need the second pass either. Vesa visits the ring occasionally now, on supply runs, old enough to walk the corridors on her own without anyone worried she'll tire before the end of them. Last time, she asked me why I'd gone back for Sarel first that day, instead of finishing the job some other way, and I told her the truth, which is that I hadn't been counting at all. I'd just been looking at who was in front of me, and choosing. She thought about that for a while, in the careful way she still thinks about most things, and then asked whether I remembered the beacon. I told her I did. She said her people were rebuilding it, a small piece of the old transport's transmitter salvaged and repaired and given a permanent place in the new apartment, not because they needed it to call for rescue anymore, but because Pell had decided a signal that had spent 300 years asking to be heard deserved to keep transmitting, even now that someone finally had. I asked what it says now. Vesa considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything, and told me they'd changed the word. It doesn't say listening anymore. It says something closer, in translation, to we were heard, repeating on a loop nobody outside their small apartment will likely ever pick up again, since there's no one left out there who needs to be listening for it. I think about that beacon more than I probably should, on the long stretches of a shift when there's nothing to do but listen to my own breathing and the hiss of the cutter. 300 years of a single word, asking the dark whether anyone was paying attention. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary, unremarkable day, on a ring station nobody expected to matter, somebody finally was. Threll still commands the extraction team. She still wears a collar, still respects the law it enforces, still believes, as she told me once, that 11 generations of caution built something worth keeping. But she tells new crew members something now that she never told me, on my own first week, and I like to think it's the truest thing anyone on that ring ever learned. The collar tells you where your limit is, she says. It has never once told you who's worth crossing it for. That part, every single time, you still have to choose.